Early disclaimer, if you want to just get straight to the battle action report, go ahead and skip on to minute 25. Welcome back to another Broken Banners battle report. This is the second in our installation of the Pennsylvania Qualifiers tournament series. This was actually my third game at that event because the second game did not come out to make a good report, in large part due to the fact that I knocked over the camera, which you'll see had a lingering effect in this next game because it was a little off angle, so sorry about that everyone. Still, I'm really excited to show this game, which is without a doubt one of my favorite games of Song that I've ever played, because it's against one of my favorite opponents, on my favorite game mode, with my two favorite factions. My opponent in this game, Pat, has shown up on one of our battle reports before, and will hopefully return in the future as our returning Baratheon player. They've been really getting good very fast, and I was really enjoying playing with them, and I always love watching them play, especially because they've chosen the better half of the Baratheon faction, Renly side. Before I get ahead of myself, I want to go over my list. I have a detailed analysis of the list that I didn't choose in this one, Dennis Mallister, in my previous video, because that's what I chose there. I'm only going to very briefly cover it so I can explain why I didn't choose my Dennis Mallister list. Dennis Mallister focuses on attrition and control, mostly by condition tokens for both of those elements. My Mallister list has two defensive infantry units, one that focuses more on having heavy armor and blunting charges, while the other one really likes a longer grind with units, especially the ones that don't want to stick around for too long, that are hitting on 4 up or don't do well after a charge. The purpose of that list is to get myself onto some objectives and score up while my opponent tries to get me off of it, and maybe I can capitalize and get a kill or two off of it. This list has a lot of elements inspired by my original faction that I've always loved and will probably always be my favorite factions, Baratheons. My other list, however, is a complementary choice, because Benjen Stark from Beyond the Wall is a cavalry commander, and I put him in an all-cavalry list. It definitely doesn't have the staying power my other list has, but what it does have is mobility and threatening ranged attacks. This list can put out a good amount of damage without having to get engaged, and it focuses on maneuverability to get into the right position and pick off a kill or two before I go score off on objectives that are hopefully far, far away from my opponent. This list does not want to grind. I do not want to sit on objectives, especially when there's a chance of that objective getting contested. I have no problem putting ranger trackers on an isolated point off on the distant end of the battle map once I've taken an enemy unit out and all the other ones are on the opposite end of the board, but I never want to get in a prolonged engagement. The tools I have in this list start with Benjen Stark and the Ranger Vanguards. Ranger Vanguards are Night's Watch medium cavalry. They're 7 points, they save 5-4, move 6, and they have a pretty solid dice profile, hitting on 3s at 7 and 5. They have no keywords, though they do have Ambush, which is going to get me a Panic token and a Weaken token if I charge the enemy in the flank or the rear, which is not too hard with them considering how fast they move and that they have Outflank. Outflank is a really nice ability to have baked into a unit because it allows me to play around that in the deployment phase, and it can really get in your opponent's head, especially when you save it for your last deployment, whether you outflank it or not. What's really important is Benjen Stark in them. Benjen Stark has Disrupt and Hidden Traps. Disrupt is a really nice defensive keyword that helps reduce the amount of damage that's coming in by giving a -1 to melee attacks with all units that are engaged. So that means whether the Vanguard are coming to help out another unit and duking up on them, or someone just charged in on them, it's going to reduce the amount of dice that they can come out, especially if I can get some Weaken tokens on out. It's really nice on a medium armor unit because they're only saving on 4, so they can take a lot of damage very quickly. The real money for this unit is in Hidden Traps, because that allows me to either slow down an enemy unit, making it extremely difficult for them to outmaneuver my high-speed cavalry, especially my speed 6 vanguards and trackers, or to pester light armored units and deal a bunch of the hits that will hopefully translate to wounds. Ranger Vanguards themselves don't hit too terribly hard, they don't have any keywords and they're throwing an average amount of dice, but Hidden Traps is really going to help push out some additional damage, and especially considering they've got Outflank and a crazy high speed, it's really hard to keep these guys away from squishy units. Benjen Stark brings 3 commander cards that all focus around the Ranger cavalry units. The first one is Benjer's signature card, Hunter's Insight. At the start of a friendly turn, I could play this card, and if there's a Ranger unit within long range of a target enemy unit, I can choose from among 3 options. I can give a friendly unit in long range a 3-inch shift. I can give a friendly unit in long range rerolls against that unit for attacks this turn, or I can prevent that enemy unit from being the target of orders or tactics cards. It's a really nice Swiss Army knife of a card, and I've always found it really useful, especially for the shift, to take an all-cavalry list to the next level of mobility. Marshal is a nice little card that allows you to turn your cavalry maneuver into the bag zone. You could also theoretically use your cavalry maneuver and then your action for a maneuver. Whatever it is, it's up to you. What's important is that it has a narrow trigger that goes off of the actual activation, and you need to be unactivated to do it. So it's really nice, though, to being able to trigger that card and heal and get that extra bit of sustain. My favorite card that Benjen brings, though, is Ride by Attack. This card allows a cavalry unit to make a march, and any unit that it moves through is going to take damage, though you can only choose one if you're marching through multiple. Those are wounds, not hits, so this is great against the heavy armor units that are really trying to bog down cavalry and trying to shunt off their attacks. What's really nice about this card, and what makes it one of the best cards in the game, in my opinion, is that you can use it while engaged. So that means that when an enemy finally thinks that they have you tracked, they finally gotten you bogged down with one of their units, you can go ahead and just march right on through them, and they take a bunch of wounds for the trouble, and they can't even pivot around to get back to looking at you, so now you're in their rear or their flank or just far, far away. This card is kind of insane, and I think the only thing that stops it from being too oppressive is that your cavalry unit has to do it on an activation. You can't do it off of anything else, though at the moment, there is really nothing like Cunning Ploy that allows you to do this, because no one that has Ride by Attack also has that card to them. Still, it's an important limitation on it. My next unit that I have are Ranger Trackers, and anyone that knows me and the Night's Watch list that I've run, I always have Ranger Trackers in them. They're a 6-speed unit for 6 points. They've got Pathfinder, making them one of the best cavalry units in the game so far as mobility is concerned. No terrain is going to be able to slow them down, and they can outrun just about every other unit in the game. They also bring Marked Target, which is giving them some really nice support to push through damage not only on their own attacks, but on other units' attacks, since the token is just going to sit around until you use it. Their melee profiles are pretty awful, but you never want these guys to be engaged anyway because they're saving 5/5. They do have a short-ranged attack, though, and that's going to be throwing 7 dice on 3s for their full rank, and on their last rank, they're throwing 5 dice, which still isn't bad. That means that being a cavalry unit, you essentially still get a full 14-inch threat range, because you can use your cavalry maneuver and then shift 2 to get into range with your range attack. The downside, though, is that it's a short-ranged attack, and that's going to leave you exposed to whoever you're shooting at, and you need to be able to fit your tray within short range, whereas long-range units have a lot more flexibility with where they're positioned before they make their attack. Still, at 6 points, I think these guys are amazing value, and you can't go wrong with them. My final unit is a pet unit of mine, Hedge Knights with a Glory Seeker. I started running these guys a lot more with Baratheons after Champions of the Stags got hit with a double nerf, because I think Hedge Knights are a great unit that make a good medium cavalry unit that become a heavy cavalry unit if you control the bags. They've got a solid offensive profile, throwing 7 dice on 3s with Sundering, though they go down to 4 at their last rank. But comparing them to Sworn Brothers, they're pretty similar, whereas the difference is Hedge Knights get a cavalry maneuver. Without an attachment, their stats are saving 4/7, but they go to 3/6 if you've got the bags. And something nice about Night's Watch is they don't really care what tactics zone you take. And I always love taking swords and bags. I think they're 2 of the most game-affecting zones next to horses. This makes them a little vulnerable early on in the round because the NCU board needs to be claimed to really set them up to full power, but I think they're solid, especially when you've got access to things like Shields of the Realms of Men and Fire That Burns Against the Cold to give you rerolls on your armor and morale saves when needed. You can't attach any of your Night's Watch cards to Hedge Knights, but honestly, I think that's okay because a lot of the cards in Night's Watch aren't worth attaching as much anymore, especially since their initial effects are still pretty good. Glory Seekers are a 1-point attachment that really help amplify the power of Hedge Knights. It's going to give them Iron Resolve and Stubborn Tenacity, so their morale is no longer a liability, even if you've got the bags, since it goes down to a 6, and you're taking less damage, even if you fail it. Stubborn Tenacity is really nice to push through a little bit of extra damage once they do get bogged down and grind, because let's be realistic, you need to have at least one unit that can duke it out and fight. But having 2 ranged units means that I can trigger a lot more panic tests on my own that I can push damage through the Stubborn Tenacity into the unit. Combine that with Corrin, and you could push through a lot of damage on a single range attack off those 6-point Ranger trackers. For my NCUs, I've got Corrin Halfhand, Donald Noy, and Dennis Mallister. Donald Noy is just a great all-around staple. And so for Night's Watch, you got him in most of your lists. He comes in with 2 order tokens that you can expend after an attack has been rolled. And you can either use it on your attacks to give you rerolls and prevent any weakened condition tokens from being spent, or you can use it on attacks against you to give yourself +1 armor and to prevent any vulnerable tokens from being expended. It's a really nice flexible tool, and those 2 tokens are really valuable. Sir Dennis Mallister gives an influence that's basically just better battle scars. You get to choose one of 3 effects, +1 for each missing rank. The first is rerolls on your attack dice for melee attacks, the second is melee attacks have highest attack die value, and the third is when you make a melee attack, you get to put a condition token out before it. This might not seem like a great fit for a list that has 2 Ranger trackers, since you never want them to make a melee attack, but it's going to happen sometimes. So having the ability to give yourself rerolls on their crappy attacks will allow you to push some kind of damage through. Where they really shine, though, is on the Hedge Knights, who, although they can already put out a vulnerable token when you've got the bags, can really push through some additional damage, always making sure they've got rerolls, and if necessary, even put out a weakened token to prevent a strong counterattack. It's also great on Ranger Vanguard for a similar reason, though they're going to be a lot more tactical with when they're making their attacks, and I might want to put my Corrin influence on them, who's my 3rd NCU. Corrin is got a permanent influence that's just going to go ahead and put 1 attack additional die on your ranged or melee attacks. So it works great with Ranger trackers, and it works great with the other 2 cavalry units as well. Corrin's claim to fame, though, is his once per game. At the start of any turn, if Corrin hasn't activated yet, you can sacrifice him, and then a target enemy unit becomes vulnerable and can't make any attack or charge actions for the entire round. I think that's really valuable, especially because the local scene that I play in deals with a lot of very aggressive commanders. Gregor and Victarion are extremely common, so having something that stops these units from making multiple attacks in a round is really nice. I think he's a great flexible tool, especially in a list like this. So with those lists in mind, we go into the pairings. I'm told that we're going to be playing Winds of Winter, and I'm playing against Pat and their Baratheons. I honestly don't even need to see Pat's list to know that I'm almost certainly going with all cavalry here. One is because Winds of Winter is a game mode where the objectives themselves don't actually score any points. I'll get more detail into the game mode later, but what's really important to know is that although there are 5 objectives, unless a player plays one of their secret mission cards that makes those points worth something, they are worthless. They're just a trap to get bogged down on, and I have no intention of doing so. Instead, there's a bunch of alternative ways to score that my cavalry can really shine in, such as ways to put out condition tokens, or being unengaged in your enemy's deployment zone. With my maneuverability and my token generation, I'm confident I can get a lot of scoring. Although I won't be able to score as many condition token points as though I was playing Mallister, that's only one card that he can really shine at, and the cavalry list is going to do great at the others. The second is Baratheons. Baratheons are notorious for having heavy armor and a really good ability to do sustained damage over the course of multiple attacks and engagements, and Renly's side specifically can push through some additional damage outside of combat and do some significant healing. That's just a lot of reasons to not get bogged down in engagement with them. Even though my Mallister list might be able to duke it out with Baratheons, I'm probably not going to be able to beat them at their own game, same as why I wasn't able to really beat Martells at their own game with maneuverability. So instead, I'm going to go with the cavalry list. Baratheons have essentially no way to move outside of the Horse Zone and their own activations. My cavalry is just going to completely leave them in the dust, especially their slower units since they've got a lot of speed 4. They don't have any ways to even pivot outside of their turns, maneuvers, or anything like that. So if I can get into their flank or their rear, their heavy armor means absolutely nothing. Combine that with the vulnerable token generation that I'm able to put out, and I'm really not too terribly worried about just about any Baratheon list that can come at me. Admittedly, once I actually see Pat's list, I do get a little bit of pause and wonder if maybe I should go for the Mallister list, because Renly has King of the South, who is my absolute favorite commander, and was in fact on the shirt that I was wearing that day. Loras Tyrell was the secondary list, but focusing first on Renly. Renly is perhaps the only commander in Baratheon that's actually giving some sense or impression of mobility to Baratheons with the card Overconfidence. Overconfidence is going to allow an infantry unit to charge a unit after they make a retreat, maneuver, or march, and that includes a cavalry maneuver. So I've done this plenty of times myself. And you can actually see this in one of my videos previously where I play against Starks, and it really swings the game in my favor, where an infantry unit uses overconfidence after a cavalry unit uses their cavalry maneuver to get into position. They take a ton of hits, take some damage, and now they're stuck in engagement that they really weren't expecting to, and the Baratheons are right where they want to. On top of that, the Renly list is also running 8 activations. It's relying on a lot of cheaper units to get there, and 5 trays on the table makes it a lot more difficult for cavalry to maneuver around and gain control of the board, especially if I'm using outflank, because that would leave him with 8 activations on the board and me with only 6, which would give the Baratheon player a lot of control. The list also has some solid charge potential with Highgarden Pikemen and Riders of Highgarden, and I've taken some considerable damage off of Riders of Highgarden checks before, especially on my Ranger trackers. Another point in favor of the Malister list is that basically everything on the Renly list is hitting on 4s, and there's nothing that I love more than getting my veteran stuck in with a unit that hits on 4, especially with cold hands around, and that includes the Riders of Highgarden. I've had it done to me a couple of times, and I've done it back my own, is when Riders of Highgarden charge into a disrupt unit to hit them with the weakened token after, and especially if there's Counterstrike, to just flip all of those hits back on it. There's nothing I'd love more than to send 10 hits right back at the squishy Riders of Highgarden. The alternative list, however, made the decision that I definitely wouldn't go with Malister, because that's Loras Tyrell and Rose Knights. Rose Knights are the quintessential Renly side Baratheon unit. They're slow, they're heavily armored with really good stats, and their ability to grind and heal is nearly unmatched. Anytime they heal, they're going to deal a wound to an engaged unit, and they're always going to heal whenever they make a melee attack with Perseverance and Valor. What really sets these guys to being the thorny bastards that they are is the Baratheon deck, the Renly side NCUs, the Loras attachment, and just, oof, I don't want to deal with that. Loras is going to be giving them Dauntless, so every time they pass a panic test, they're going to be healing one. He's got Growing Strong, so anytime they activate, they can heal. Whenever they make a melee attack, they can heal. Courtney is going to make it, so if I take an NCU zone, they can heal. There's the Bags, which already heals. There's Shira, who can also heal whenever she takes the crowns. In sum, there's a ton of ways that Rose Knights are going to be able to push damage through that I don't even get to make armor saves against. Combine that with Overgrowth, who's going to deal hits whenever an attack is made against one of the attached units. It's just not something I want to get bogged down in. This Loras list also has Riders of Highgarden, so I guess no matter which way I go, my Ranger trackers are in danger. And this use also has a Resilient unit. Rainbow Guard have Resilience, which is a really nice order, but at the end of the day, Rainbow Guard have only 8 wounds, so I'm not as worried about duking it out with them, whereas Stag Knights have the full 12. Plus, Rainbow Guard Brienne is in there, which is giving the Stag Knights actual battle scars. This is another unit that getting bogged down with, you're just going to watch your unit get melted away. As the rounds progress, Stag Knights get stronger and stronger, and as you beat them up more, which is hard to do with that resilience and pretty fair saves, Brienne's just going to keep buffing them up so that they're never going to get weaker. They're going to have rerolls, they're going to be throwing a lot of dice, and they're going to have a lot of keywords. Getting stuck in with Stag Knights is a great way to lose. And then finally, there's Thornwatch, which are one of my favorite units in the game. Before I was introduced to Night's Watch, actually, they were essentially what Ranger trackers are to me now. I love them. They're a short-ranged machine gun unit. They got Sundering so they can punch through some armor, but their claim to fame is that they've got Swift Strike and Regroup, which means that whenever they make a melee attack, they're going to be able to retreat and then heal off of it. So you've got these little guys shooting you in the side with their Sundering crossbows that are going to hurt. And if you end up getting stuck in with them, they're just going to slap you in the face with their little swords, and then they're going to run off and they're going to heal off the trouble. And you find yourself out of position and worse for wear. They're incredibly hard to tie down, especially if you plan on doing so with melee attacks. They're a lot more durable than they look with the amount that they can heal. You kind of have to double tap them or find ways to deal damage outside of your activations, such as hidden traps. The NCUs in this list are also notable. In the previous list, it's a lot of stuff that just helps out with his own thing. But here, you've got unique things with Elena. First, we're going to talk about Courtney Penrose, though, because he's shared in both lists and is probably in every friendly list that's not running Courtney as a commander. Courtney has 3 tokens, and whenever an enemy activates, you can expend one of those Courtney tokens to target 2 zones on the tactics board. And if an NCU claims either of those 2 zones on that activation, Courtney gets essentially a pool of healing that's equal to D3 plus 2. And you could distribute those wounds however you like across your units. So it's another way for Rose Knights to heal. Yay. It's a lot of zone control, though. Generally, Courtney's not actually going to heal. He's just going to deter the opponent from actually claiming the zone they want and leave it open for the Tyrell player. Courtney's a workhorse and a staple to the Renly side Baratheon identity. Shira Errol just gives a few minor buffs for one of the 3 zones she takes, crowns, letters, bags. She's often taken alongside Riders of Highgarden to give another way to take a weakened token off of Riders, since Riders are completely shut down by a single weakened token. Olenna Tyrell, though, is the notable one, and whenever you see her, you've got to pay attention to that list. She's a nightmare for so many factions because you don't realize how good your NCU is until she blanks it. Olena's got 2 abilities, and the primary one is that when she claims a zone, she can blank an NCU's card. That's really good in the era of the game that we're playing now, where you've got some crazy NCUs like Corrin, or Tywin, or Donalnoy, or Aemon, or there's a lot of good NCUs in Night's Watch, and I'd like to use them. Looking at these 2 lists and pondering a little bit more, I've decided that I'm not interested in getting bogged down and engaged. If I get bogged down with Loras, he's going to chew me apart with a bunch of hits and wounds, and it's going to suck. If I get bogged down with Renly's just going to run away, and then I'm going to get flank charged by Highgarden Pikemen or Riders of Highgarden, because the activation advantage, especially if I outflank, is going to allow the Baratheon player to just maneuver where they want, which is really awkward whenever a Baratheon player outmaneuvers you, and honestly, I would never be able to live that down. Combine that with the fact that Winds of Winter doesn't give a benefit to being on the objectives, I just don't see a reason to play the games that Baratheons want to play. They can have their heavy armor on their points. I'm going to run around their flank, put some vulnerable tokens on them, and shoot them, and make Rose Knights wonder what the hell they're paying 7 points for. I can exploit the weak points of the Baratheon army with an all-cavalry list, while essentially negating all of their strengths, especially on this game mode. There's a couple secret mission cards that care about the objectives, but by and large, I think I can play around them, and I think the horse list is the way to go. The final thing that we really need to talk about in depth before we get into the battle report is the game mode itself, the Winds of Winter. Again, this is my favorite game mode, and I've gone through it before, and I'll go through it again just because I think a lot of players don't really appreciate some of the nuance to this game mode. The objectives themselves don't actually score anything, though there are 5 of them set up in the traditional map. Instead, you've got a mission deck, which came in the package with the objective cards. You're going to take mission cards 11 and 12, which are really nice and useful cards, one of which just turns the objectives on for the round, and the other one allows you to steal first player and score a point if you're behind, which can really make this game mode very swingy, and then you get to select 4 additional mission cards, so you've got 6, 1 for each round and 1 left over. You start playing these on round 2 at the start of the round, and first player shows theirs. After selecting and revealing them, player 2 gets to show theirs. At the end of the round, mission cards are tossed off. For controlling and objectives, it's the same rules as normal. Solo wounds are their ranks. You sit on it completely to control it, yada yada. But again, the objectives do not grant victory points unless specifically stated by a mission card. Instead, each revealed mission card may be scored by each player if the requirements are met. So you're going to have a lot of rounds where 2 cards involving the tactics board are going to get played, and that's where all the scoring comes from. You might take swords and give your opponent 2 victory points. It can be messy. I love it. Every game is unique and different, and going through the objective cards and the mission cards is a really good way to prepare for this game mode, so I highly recommend everyone go take a peek at those. That said, we're diving on in. I chose for my deck Mission 2, Mission 4, Mission 6, and Mission 10. I almost always choose Mission 2, Mission 4, just because there's a lot of big swings that can happen in a game just because someone's taking swords or horses first, especially if you're outflanking, and both of those 2 really punish that. Mission 3 kind of does that, and it's also pretty nice against Baratheons because they really want the letters, but I really want those other 2 cards more. Mission 6 is just huge whenever you've got a lot of mobility, especially with cavalry. You get to score 2 points if you've got an unengaged friendly unit in the enemy deployment zone, and especially against Baratheons, 2 of the units are not getting anywhere close to my deployment zone. They don't want to. It's just the Riders of Highgarden and Thornwatch. And if either of those 2 want to ignore the rest of the battlefield so they can go run off there, by all means, please do so. The last one is just turning on objectives, but specifically only the one on my opponent's side of the battlefield. My cavalry can pretty easily get onto the Baratheon side of the battlefield, while the Baratheons probably don't want to get there, and they're going to be exposing themselves if they do. So I think that's a really useful trick to turn on if I need to score a point or 2, or even just get in my opponent's head and make them reconsider what they're doing. For terrain, we did the fortified battlefield setup out of the preset deployments in the book. I placed the stakes to cover my ranger trackers on the side and put a palisade to be obnoxious and block infantry. I placed my ranger trackers opposite from the stakes because it's safe for them to run over, allowing them to threaten 2 different objectives on their side. Pat is going to go ahead and put Thornwatch all the way on the opposite side, facing their own 2 objectives, as Thornwatch are probably the fastest unit Pat's got and extremely vulnerable to ranger trackers since they've got such low armor, and they are still infantry. I'm going to place my white ranger trackers next to my black ranger trackers, and I'm just going to try and avoid the infantry as best as possible and make Pat work their way towards me. Stag Knights are going down the center, but slightly off-center to work around the palisade if needed, because that's one of the reasons I put it there. Infantry are going to have a lot harder time to get around it, and it's just far enough away that if I need to, my ranger trackers can maneuver on over to it and slap it. I then put my Hedge Knights down straight across from the Stag Knights, also avoiding the palisade, and the Riders of Highgarden go down to screen out the 2 Ranger trackers and protect the flanks, which is exactly where the Ranger trackers normally want to go. I then choose to outflank Benjen, and Rose Knights go in between the Thornwatch and Stag Knights, providing a really sturdy side of the board that I'm going to do my best this game to ignore and avoid. The round starts, and I put Corn onto the letters to weaken the Riders of Highgarden and draw up 2. Influencing my Black Ranger trackers. Pat's going to activate Elena and put her onto the horses and maneuver the Thornwatch up towards the objectives. Elena's going to shut down Donald Noy, and spoiler alert, she's going to do that every single round for the entirety of the game, and it makes me really sad. I put Donald Noy onto the bags just so that Pat can't remove that weakened token off the riders. Courtney's going to pass, and I maneuver march my Black Ranger trackers open, leaving the swords. I generally like doing that with my ranger trackers because since they have a ranged attack, there's always a threat the moment anything gets in range. Pat doesn't want to deal with that though, so they just put Shira onto the swords and block it, so I activate Malster, crowns out the riders, nothing happens. After that, the Stag Knights march forward, and I go ahead and move my White Ranger trackers to go threaten towards the flanks, but still stay near the objectives and the stakes. I've got just enough stakes signing up that if the riders charge my trackers, they're going to have to land on them. After that, Pat's going to march up the Rose Knights to start getting them towards the rest of the game. I'm then going to activate my Hedge Knights and maneuver march them towards my 2 Ranger trackers because I'm not engaging the Rose Knights. Ever. Like, you can't pay me to do that. In fact, I start pointing at them and I start saying, I'm never going to engage that unit. It's not going to happen. You couldn't pay me to do it. Stop trying. After that, Pat's going to march the Thornwatch forward all the way towards my side, which is not exactly what I was expecting when I pulled the objective cards. I don't want Pat to be near my objectives because I want to be able to score opposite ends without Pat scoring, but I'll deal with that when we get there. Since I outflanked, I'm an activation down, and Pat gets to activate their riders and maneuver march them towards my cavalry to screen and threaten my ranger trackers. However, it's 3-on-1 and not looking like a good position for the Riders of Highgarden. Round 2 starts, and I'm going second. So, Pat chooses Mission 12, which is scoring a point for each objective controlled, and I choose Mission 4, scoring a point for each tactic zone that the opponent claims before you do, and I outflank Benjen in behind Pat's line. I played my card with the intention of outflanking because it's going to punish Pat if they try and use things like horses to respond to the outflank positioning, which is exactly what Pat does. Pat activates Elena, putting them onto the horses, shutting down Donald Noy, and pivoting the Rose Knights around to trap in the Ranger Vanguard, which are more or less boxed on in there. I'm going to activate my Black Ranger trackers and then maneuver them and shoot into the Riders of Highgarden, marking target to make them vulnerable so I can try and push through as much damage as I can. Though I don't really get many hits through, and I don't even bother using the vulnerable token because Pat doesn't make any saves. Pat, seeing the writing on the wall and that the Riders of Highgarden are not long for this world on that position, is going to take them off the low wall and charge my trackers in the face. Pat's going to play Ours of the Fury to get +1 to hit. So hitting on 3s is really going to help deal with that weaken token, and Pat's going to hope to do a significant amount of damage on the Ranger trackers, though I'm not entirely sure what the play is after that. I'm a little nervous there might be a final strike to bait a melee attack out, but I'm just going to fill those riders with holes. So I activate my white Ranger trackers, move them on over, and shoot those riders in the flank. They are pretty healthy, so I'm really not expecting too much out of this. I know I'm going to need the Hedge Knights to figure them out, and again, the final strike's a little nerve-wracking, but I get a huge hit off, and Pat is going to bomb this panic test, and I'm going to get way more damage through on the Riders of Highgarden than I expected. With only 2 wounds left, I couldn't give a shit about final strike. After that, Pat's going to activate the Thornwatch and move them to trap in my Ranger Vanguard. Hidden traps are going to take a full rank off of them though, but at least this way, the Vanguard aren't going to be able to rear charge the Thornwatch and completely blap them, which is something that has happened pretty commonly before, and you might even see in a later game. I activate my Hedge Knights, and I go for the long bomb charge on the Riders, because if I can knock them out early before they get a chance to heal, I'm feeling like I'm in really good shape to win this game. And I land the big charge, I get on in there, don't even care about the low wall, because Sundering in the flank is -2, low wall's only giving +1, they're already vulnerable. Pat needed the miracle save to try and get off of that, and they don't get it. So the Hedge Knights get the kill, the Riders are done for, and I'm going to surge forth to start wrapping them around the rear. The Hedge Knights are a little bit slower, so I'm not used to getting them into the rear, but they are devastating. There is nothing Pat's got that's not going to be saving 6 up from Sundering in the rear. Pat is going to try and protect themselves from getting completely enveloped and get the Rose Knights locked in on the Vanguard. They're trapped in and boxed in pretty good by the Thornwatch. Pat unfortunately gets a 1 on the charge, so no rerolls, not going to take much damage, but I'm going to play Ride by Attack because this is exactly the trap that I had laid, having gotten that in my original hand, and I'm going to march right on through and get my Vanguard into the rear too. I actually felt a little bit bad because Pat had no idea that Ride by Attack was even a card. So they were very surprised and displeased when they found out. They lost a whole rank for their good positioning and doing a good job tracking in my cavalry. After that, Pat's going to maneuver the Stag Knights onto the center point, and then we're just going to pass NCUs to avoid giving each other points, and then I'm going to have the last activation. I put Corrin onto letters despite a Courtney token, and Pat's going to get a pretty big heal that's going to help split off onto the Rose Knights that just got hurt and the Thornwatch. The next round starts, and I play Mission 6, as there is essentially no way that Pat can possibly stop me from having a unit unengaged in their deployment zone, and they can't get into mine. Pat plays Mission 11 to steal first player and go up a point. Pat's first activation is Elena onto the bags, healing Thornwatch and shutting off Donald Noy, so I activate Dennis the Menace, putting his influence onto the White Ranger trackers and maneuvering them. Pat activates Courtney and puts him onto the swords to block the zone, so I pass it Donald Noy. Pat activates Shira, putting her onto the letters and weakening my trackers, and then my turn, I put Corrin onto the crowns and crown zap the Stag Knights. Poor Pat can't catch a break and takes 2 wounds. Pat then decides, screw it, my luck can't get much worse, and charges the Stag Knights on into my Hedge Knights in the flank. And I get a much better roll than I had any right to, considering I was saving 5 up. And even though I fail the panic test, I take minimal damage because of the Iron Resolve. I then activate my White Ranger trackers and move them into the rear to shoot. I'm expecting to just tear through the Stag Knights at this point though, because in the rear, they're saving garbage, 6 up. The first shot doesn't do much through the weakened token though, but Pat unfortunately fails the panic test. I later learned that Pat had both Baratheon convictions in hand, and that was why they were playing so aggressively with the Stag Knights, because that's 4 points of healing just sitting there. Instead of healing though, Pat's taking additional damage from the failed panic test, and that's going to be rough. Pat's then going to move the Rose Knights after that attack to try and get back into the battle, but their speed 4, it's taken a while. I activate my other Ranger trackers and shoot into the Stag Knight's flank. I'm not expecting as much off this one since it's there, but I get a full boat of hits and Pat has to use Resilience and still doesn't manage to make any armor saves after the vulnerable token. Between that and the Stubborn Tenacity, Pat's taking a ton of damage. Still not able to catch a break. The poor Stag Knights fail that final panic test, and that's going to be it for them. Not being able to pass any and heal off the Baratheon convictions turned what could have been a really good Baratheon play into just throwing away a unit, unfortunately. They really probably should have passed at least one of those 3 panic tests, but sometimes it is that way. Pat's then going to go ahead and maneuver the Thornwatch up to take that point, and I'm going to Hidden Traps a full rank off of them. I then activate Benjen, using Marshall to heal up a horse and then maneuver. Pat's down activations at this point, so I have my Hedge Knights last to go, and I march maneuver them towards the Thornwatch, hoping to pick up an easy kill and get in on them, since I actually get to go first next round. Round 4 starts, and there's no more Mission 11 to steal that away from me. So I'm just going to play Mission 12 so I can capitalize on the board control that I have now that I have all of my units and Pat's down so many. Pat plays Mission 2 to shut me off of the swords and the horses, which are both good ideas since they're both zones that I'd like to take. My Hedge Knights are going to charge into the Thornwatch and do a pretty solid amount of damage. However, Pat's luck is starting to turn, and they're going to get a chance to play one of those Baratheon convictions since they passed the panic test, and that's going to heal up the Thornwatch back up to 6. I'm going to play Take the Black to try and heal some of the damage, and I'm going to then get Final Strike to basically undo that, so I'm glad I was able to get a little something off of it. We had a bit of a question with Take the Black since I had destroyed a rank, but then the Thornwatch healed back up. TO ruled that Take the Black requires the rank having essentially been destroyed at the end of the attack. So I only get to heal up 1, but it still negates some of the Final Strike damage. After that, Olena's going to go onto the bags, once again shutting off Donalnoy, and once again healing up the Thornwatch. I activate Malster and put him onto the swords to influence the Hedge Knights and slap the snot out of those Thornwatch, getting them down to 3 wounds, though they're going to pass panic tests, so the second Baratheon conviction heals them so that they are controlling the objective yet again. Shira grabs the letters, weakening my trackers. I'm going to move Benjen on in, who's going to race and march to get right up in the Thornwatch grill and park on top of them. Start of Pat's turn, I'm going to sacrifice Corrin to make the Thornwatch vulnerable. Not because I want to do damage, but to make sure that I don't want them doing damage to the Hedge Knights. They're only at 7 wounds, and I've had some real bad luck against sustained assault attacks with them before in the past, so I play it safe. Thornwatch are going to activate, and Growing Strong is going to heal them up, and then they are going to use their action to do the only thing they can do, which is retreat since they can't attack, and that's going to heal them up even further. And it's going to make sure that they're staying on the point so that they score up off the end of the round and maybe move away from a crushing defeat towards a standing defeat, which often does make a big difference between 3rd and 4th place at tournaments. After that, I'm going to activate my Ranger Trackers, and I'm going to attach it now as Watch has ended because there's no point in discarding it. Even if I don't anticipate it being useful, might as well stick it on a unit. Ranger Trackers go park themselves on a point, and the Rose Knights continue doing the Rose Knight Shuffle, trying to box in my speedy cavalry. After that, I just have my other Ranger Trackers who are also just going to move their way on over to a point because there's really not much else for them to do. I could try and help hunt down the Thornwatch, but the Hedge Knights and the Vanguard should have them down pat between hidden traps and their own attacks, and I just don't want to deal with the Rose Knights. I might be able to kill them with enough ranged attacks, but no, why bother? Forget Rose Knights. This is advice to everyone that has to deal with Rose Knights. Don't fight them. Seriously, you're only going to hate it yourself. That's it for that round. So we're going to move on to the next one, where Pat's going to play Mission 6, and I'm going to play Mission 10, though they're really not too terribly important this stage. Pat's going to hope to get the Thornwatch in there, and maybe by some miracle survive and get unengaged and score off that, but I'm really not counting on it too much, and neither is Pat, especially because yet another Hidden Traps takes off max damage off the Thornwatch. Pat really has just been having terrible time with the dice. Pat needs to get lucky at this point, and Pat has not been getting lucky. Instead, I have been. Benjen's going to go ahead and charge on into the flank of the Thornwatch, and I'm thinking between the Vulnerable token and the Panic token, there's no way the Thornwatch can survive. And gratefully for me, I was correct. That's going to be it for the Thornwatch, and Pat makes another classic Pat roll, where there's a bunch of 6s that don't actually make much of a difference after the Vulnerable token, and that's it for them. At that point, we just talk out the game because the most that Pat can possibly score is 0, since I played the one that's going to only be giving objective points off of opposite side objectives, which my units can easily control at least one of. I'm going to be able to get back into the enemy deployment zone, and that's going to be that for the game. This is a really tough matchup for Baratheons. I think Pat played probably about as well as they could, all things considering. Baratheons just really don't have many mobility tools, and it's one of the reasons I actually started shying a little bit further away from them as my meta became a lot more aggressive, and I started realizing that armor stat doesn't mean much in this current day and age where you've got double sundering, silenced men, precision, auto wounds, and all this other stuff. The best way to survive is to just not take the damage in the first place. That means condition tokening and positioning. Still, I really enjoyed this game, and I know I learned a fair bit about my own faction by playing this, and I'm hoping Pat learned a fair bit about Baratheons and Night's Watch along the way. It's always a great game with Pat, and I'm looking forward to more in the future. Thank you everyone who came by and listened, or watched, or both if you're a madman and somehow watch videos with sound on. I personally don't know how you do it. But stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have the third installation of this series coming out soon, and more videos of other kinds of battle reports coming out as well. Take care, everyone.